Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Anthony Breach. I'm Director of Policy and Research at Centre for Cities, and I'll be taking you through this afternoon's deep dive into Cities Outlook 2026, and particularly what that means for Scottish cities, and particularly on that kind of connection which we're investigating in Cities Outlook this year, which is that link between local economic growth and local living standards at the local and the national level as well. There's a Q&A function in the chat. So by all means, as we're going along, shouldn't take more than 20 minutes, sprinkle your questions throughout there, and we get to have a discussion at the end. We'll get to go into these, any questions you may have in a bit more detail. But I'm going to share my slides now. And just to reiterate, so Cities Outlook contains a broad range of outputs, includes the reports, podcasts, and events that you're currently watching, the data tool, and various blogs as well. So by all means, if you want to find out a bit more, scan the QR link and you will unlock a treasure trove of new data from us. So this is just the introduction. So before we get into the meat of it, and just to reiterate something which is a constant theme of our work, but I think it's particularly important this time around, is to emphasize that Britain and indeed Scotland are urban. That whatever economic or social impacts that you look at, whether that's low greenhouse gas emissions, population, highly skilled residents, highly innovative firms, GVA, highly skilled, knowledge-intensive jobs, indeed other things like poverty, and inequality, we see these things are concentrated within urban areas and within urban parts of Scotland and Britain. And this is an important implication, which is that while you're seeing the performance of cities obviously matters for their residents, it also matters to the national economies of both countries as well. Indeed, it's not really possible for either Scotland or the UK more broadly to succeed if their cities are not succeeding. So with Cities Outlook 2026, we have good news for Scottish cities and also, unfortunately, some bad news. Just to start off with the good news first, when we look at our measure of living standards, which is what we are particularly one and a half of the things we are interested in, which we're measuring as disposable income, which is all of the average income left in a household after taxes and benefits, but before housing costs. We can see that Scottish cities do moderately well compared to their peers in the rest of the UK. So Edinburgh, as we can see from this chart, has the highest average disposable income of any city in the country outside the greater southeast of England. Aberdeen as well, despite struggles with the oil industry in recent years, maintains kind of a position in the upper half of the distribution. Indeed, Glasgow has the highest average disposable income of any big city outside of London, apart from Bristol, which is something of an anomaly across a number of indicators. Even Dundee, which is the poorest performing of the Scottish cities, isn't in the bottom tier of places that are really struggling to maintain a high disposable income, even though it clearly faces its challenges. So in a steady state, a kind of levels point, there's much for Scottish cities to be pleased with. However, unfortunately, the bad news comes from looking at change since 2008. And unlike other parts of the country, we've seen a decrease in average disposable incomes for all the Scottish cities since the global financial crisis. Again, you can see these highlighted here in purple on the chart. What this means is that even though across British cities, average disposable incomes in their entirety increased by 2.4% over this period, and in the top performing cities, our 11 that we've singled out for analysis nationally, led the economy by 5.2% in disposable incomes growth. In Scotland, we saw average disposable incomes shrink in cities by minus 6.7% across that entire period, with Aberdeen seeing the largest loss of any British city, with a decrease in average disposable incomes of minus 18.7%. So these are very large negative changes to spending power and living standards in urban Scotland over the past almost 20 years at this point. So one response might be that, well, the average is, that's not good news. That's disconcerting for sure. But so long as things at the very bottom are insulated and protected, then it actually might be acceptable to tolerate lower disposable incomes and lower living standards more generally. Well, obviously there is a value judgment to be made on the merits of redistribution versus inequality. We don't really see a strong trade-off at the local level between average incomes and levels of redistribution. If anything, places with lower average incomes tend to have higher levels of deprivation at the local level. And you can see from this chart that although places like Aberdeen and Edinburgh have a relatively small share of neighbourhoods that are in the bottom 20% for deprivation, Glasgow and Dundee, with again lower disposable incomes, have unusually high levels of deprivation, with well over a third of all neighbourhoods in these urban areas in the bottom 20% for deprivation nationally. So the challenge, in particular for Dundee and Glasgow, is if they want to help the people at the very bottom of the distribution in their urban areas, is figuring out how can they move down this particular slope, how can they increase disposable incomes for everyone in the city and increase opportunities for people, including those with the least. So how did we get here? I think this is kind of an important question to understand both the scale of the challenge and also what might be done to address it. And we've broken this assessment down into three phases: before the financial crisis, the immediate recovery, and the longer recovery after the immediate aftermath. And again, we're particularly interested in this link here between economic growth here on the vertical axis, or here on the horizontal axis, forgive me, and living standards, which are represented on the vertical axis. And you can see here with our individual cities, with Edinburgh and Glasgow highlighted, that most cities across the UK, including Scottish cities, had a good connection between growth in living standards and economic growth before the financial crisis, with around 3% increases to both being pretty typical across the country. And indeed, Edinburgh and Glasgow performing pretty close to the Scottish and UK norm. The financial crisis hits in 2008, and this causes a severe shock to the national economy and by extension to local economies as well. So economic growth is much lower as a result everywhere. And as a result, average disposable incomes fall in nearly every urban area in Britain. And that includes Edinburgh and Glasgow. And we can sort of start to see here that, again, Edinburgh and Glasgow and some of the other Scottish cities are already beginning to underperform slightly compared to their counterparts in the rest of the UK. Their economies are shrinking over this period, and their changes to disposable incomes are also slightly faster than in other parts of the UK. If we then look to the most recent decade, so in the aftermath of that immediate aftermath, we can see nationally that while there has been some return to economic growth, with the UK getting to within spitting distance of its pre-2008 trend, and with many cities kind of meeting or surpassing their pre-financial crisis rate, living standards doesn't recover to nearly the same degree. And so we end up in this strange position in which economic growth is averaging almost 2% per year, but living standards are not improving at all. So this disconnect has emerged in both the national economy, but also within many local economies between the growth that they're experiencing and then also the changes to living standards within these communities. Where Scotland stands out is that Scottish cities see a particularly large disconnect between economic growth and then living standards growth. So while, for instance, Edinburgh sees economic growth that is comparable to the national level, British level, since before the financial crisis, living standards continue to decline over this period. Similarly, Glasgow just about beats the British national average for economic growth, but living standards again are continuing to decline in this period. So there's even kind of excluding Aberdeen, which due to the oil and gas shock can be seen as having a particularly difficult time in the very bottom left corner. You can see there is a broader problem where Scottish cities have a stronger disconnect between economic growth and living standards growth over the past decade. So, and for our framework, we zoomed in on that most recent period and tried to look at those cities that are achieving above average economic growth and above average growth to disposable incomes, and tried to see what lessons we could draw from those for cities across the country and indeed for national government policy. There were no Scottish cities in this category. So relative to the rest of the UK, Scottish cities are falling behind. Again, there's a particular problem taking place in Aberdeen, which is experiencing such a shock to its economic and living standards that it can't be displayed on this chart conveniently. If you'd like to know more, it's available in the previous chart. It's that green dot there in the bottom left corner. So the problem we're presented with, I think this applies nationally, but in some ways it's particularly stark for Scotland, is we need to understand first, what do affluent cities have? And there is still obviously affluence within Scottish cities, but particularly in the Scottish case, understanding what improving cities are doing can help set a course for Scottish cities to correct the disconnection that they've experienced over the past 15 years and hopefully match high rates of economic growth with improved living standards on the ground. And we think there's three really important ingredients that are behind this. So the first is connected to the underpinning any strong, successful local economy is a strong private sector. Now, if you've read our PDFs and all of our different reports that we put out, you'll see that we make a strong distinction between two different kinds of private sector work. On the one hand, you have local services, so things like cafes, supermarkets, dentists, solicitors, and those businesses locate in places where there are customers, right? And you find them in every part of the country, and they don't really tend to drive economic performance all that much, even though they're important for employment. There's a second category that we think is particularly interesting, which are called tradable or exporting jobs. And this includes things like manufacturing, oil and gas, particularly in the case of Aberdeen, but it also includes kind of highly skilled, knowledge-intensive business professional services. So that's things like software, it's marketing, it's publishing, it's graphic design. It's all these things that we know are the global comparative advantage of the British economy. And what happens when you investigate the tradable base of different urban parts of Britain and indeed Scotland is you see a very close connection between the appeal and the strength of a place to knowledge-intensive services and its wider economic performance, and thereby its living standards as well. So we can see on this chart that by looking, which shows both the share of jobs that are in those knowledge-intensive services in purple, their economic productivity in blue, and indeed workplace wages in green. By grouping these three categories according to the disposable income metrics, which we've seen in the previous chart, we can see there's a very strong association where places with more KIBS jobs have higher productivity and thereby have higher wages, which then translates into disposable incomes. So Edinburgh, and obviously, Edinburgh performs strongly on these metrics, and Aberdeen has historically as well. Glasgow is kind of a middling performer across these metrics in terms of disposable incomes and productivity, whereas Dundee is more of a laggard in this respect, and many of its kind of economic difficulties stem from this fundamentally weak private sector. So improving the appeal of places to the private sector is important to places or to improve disposable incomes. The second factor that we're interested in is, or second ingredient that we think is significant, is access to employment. Now, there are two different components to this, but by any metric where you look at deprivation or disposable incomes, participation in the labour market and work is a crucial factor in determining both individual household living standards, but also for wider neighbourhood and urban living standards. And we can see there are places in Scotland that are successful here. So Aberdeen is one of the leaders of in the whole of the UK for disposable incomes. It's not a surprise that it has a particularly high employment rate for any city in the UK as well. Similarly, Aberdeen, maintains a kind of moderately strong disposable income in the present day. That's connected again to a moderate performance in terms of the employment rate of Aberdeen. By contrast, Dundee and Glasgow, places with above average deprivation that we've seen in the previous chart, don't just have relatively low levels of disposable income, they have unusually low levels of employment for their level of disposable incomes. So a large part of the deprivation element and the low living standards that face in these places stem from poor access to labour markets and opportunities that come with that. Glasgow particularly stands out here as having a large distance from the overall trend. So we think there are important interventions to be made here, both at a national level and a local level, in skills, in ready to work, in welfare policy. But particularly for big cities like Glasgow, we argue that transport and physical access to the labour market is important for improving average living standards. So this map, which we show in our National Cities Outlook report, shows Manchester, and in purple it shows neighbourhoods where average deprivation has increased, and in green it shows neighbourhoods where average deprivation has decreased, with the big purple octopus in the middle, big blue octopus in the middle, showing the connectivity to the city centre within 30 minutes by public transport. Now, what's happened over the past decade is that because Manchester has been expanding its public transport network so much, is places that are well connected now to the city centre have experienced twice as fast a reduction in neighbourhood levels of deprivation compared to places that are not well connected to the city centre of Manchester by public transport. This is because the city centre is providing opportunity to people who live within the catchment of the transport network. So over the past decade, it's added tens of thousands of more jobs, 2/3 of which are in those highly skilled professional services. And now actually, even though Manchester is much smaller, the share of jobs that are in these highly skilled services are at a similar percentage to London. So Manchester, even though it's still got more to do, now has an economy that really resembles the capital for the first time in its history. And that's making a difference to average disposable incomes and to neighbourhood deprivation as well, all connected up by the transport network. Separately, we've done research looking into how these things would play out within Scotland. This is from a paper we did a couple of years ago, looking at the public transport network within Glasgow. We've identified that there's still potential for greater integration and greater devolution within Glasgow to expand the reach of its transport network and provide more opportunities to more of the city's residents. So I've popped some links there in the bottom in case you want to learn a bit more. The third ingredient that we look at is actually particularly relevant in successful places like Edinburgh and to some degree Aberdeen, which is removing constraints on growing urban areas. So we can see that with economic growth and with high demand to live in a place, there come costs. And unless that demand is met through more supply of housing stock, if quantity is unable to adjust, then prices will adjust instead. So having local action to ensure that the supply of housing is responsive, that increases to demand are met by increases in supply, is very important if local economic growth is to translate into improved disposable incomes and higher living standards. In this regard, the government's action in England to advance the planning reform agenda, particularly within cities, is very important, not just in places like Brighton and London, but also places like Warrington and Manchester that are seeing success, that are seeing growth, but run the risk of encountering housing costs as a bottleneck on their residents' living standards in the near future, unless these things are changed. So what does this all add up to? So, in some respects, it's a difficult picture for Scottish cities. On the other hand, the fact that the baseline levels of affluence within Scottish cities are relatively high, all things considered, means that there's a good foundation for Scottish cities to work with and to build upon, such that a kind of bounce back for Scottish cities would be unusually large compared to other parts of the UK. Obviously, Aberdeen's fortunes are to a large extent connected to the global trends within the oil and gas industry, and if Aberdeen had performed at the level that we've identified with our top 11 cities that saw high growth in living standards and high economic growth, average disposable incomes cumulatively over the decade would have been over £30,000 higher. But even in places like Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Dundee, we're talking about kind of average of £10,000, £9,000, £8,000 of cumulative income would have been higher in these other Scottish cities if they had performed closer to the leaders within the UK. So to the extent that Scottish cities can improve on the three ingredients that we've highlighted and can make themselves restore that connection between living standards and economic growth, there's lots of potential for Scottish cities to become even better places to live and work than they are today. So just to kind of wrap up from me and summarize what we've been discussing today, even though there's kind of this political imperative to manage the cost of living with fixing things to price controls on bills, freezing fares, or very micro interventions into parts of household budgets, if too much of the political strategy and the economic policy agenda becomes absorbed by these micro interventions, the bigger picture, the big message that ultimately rising living standards depend on economic growth risks being lost. And the big priority that should be facing local and national policymakers is how to reconnect growth to living standards, rather than to kind of engage on these, salient and popular, but ultimately, risk being empty interventions on household bills. To do this, both national government, but also local government as well, need to learn lessons from the most successful cities and to drive growth in a way that people can see and feel within a few miles of where they live and where they work. So first, on the business base is, again, working with the UK government and Scottish government to deliver an industrial strategy that has a place-based focus, again, focusing on improving the appeal of urban areas to those highly innovative, knowledge-intensive businesses that we know underpin productivity growth. Second is, on the employment side, is interventions in skills and through the welfare system to increase access to local labour markets. This should be combined with local flexibility to allow places to design policy and interventions to meet the needs of their place and ultimately the business base and opportunities available on people's doorsteps. That also has to be combined, especially in Glasgow, with interventions to improve transport devolution, to increase physical access to labour markets. The experience of other UK cities shows that metro mayors are very strong institutions for delivering these improvements in a way that is felt by people in their day-to-day lives. And the final point is on easing constraints, continuing to pick up the pace of planning reform and moving away from the old kind of 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, highly discretionary system of planning control, and moving towards a more European style, a more New Zealand style of planning system that is rules-based, that's organized around zoning, but is ultimately much more responsive and much more pro-supply than the system that we currently have. So that's all for me in terms of a deep dive for Scotland. If you'd like to learn more about all the data that we produce as part of this project, either with a Scottish focus or with a national, or with comparing to other parts of the UK, check out our City Monitor latest data tool, which includes graphics, looking, for example, at this, looking at neighbourhood deprivation in different parts of the country. We have much more than that besides. We also have our data tool, which we publish alongside City Monitor, which again provides you an interactive map and allows you to create and download your own data sets to investigate the performance of Scottish cities or your city on any metric that you care to compare against, with both statically across the whole of the UK right now, but also going back in time to, I think at least for some data series, until the late 1990s. There's lots of room to kind of track and measure cities and how their economic performance has changed over time. So that really is all for me. I haven't checked your questions yet. There might be questions. If there are, I'll see if I can answer them. But by all means, if you'd like to learn more, give the code a quick scan, or if you miss it, go on to centreforcities.org, and we will, or indeed kind of get in touch with us, and we'll be very happy to answer any questions you may have. Okay, great. So we've got questions. Q&A box is here. Here we go. Questions here. So disposable income scale on the graphs only went to £25,000. Is it a mistake? It's not. So we're looking at average incomes, average disposable incomes within places. So we are including households who are substantially below that average, but we are also including households that are substantially above that average as well, and flattening them out to get an indication of what typical living standards are like within each urban area. If we did include it all the way to zero, it would actually be quite a difficult chart to read. But even by doing that and by controlling for that base effect, we're able to understand the geographies a bit better across the country. Is there any data on higher education or further education institutions being present in cities? So great question, Douglas. There is a Centre for Cities report on the impact of higher education in British cities. That report was called Town and Gown. We published that last year, and we have looked across 3 different metrics, including kids' employment, regeneration and housing, high street spending, but also the connection to highly skilled, innovative firms and spin-outs. I think the conclusions we got from that were in some ways pretty counterintuitive, in that often we found universities actually had the biggest impact in places that we don't traditionally associate with university cities. So places like I think kind of Leicester, and I think also Leeds performed very well, and Hull were very reliant on their universities for exactly that kind of knowledge-intensive work as well. There is definitely Scottish data available on that, so check out that report, or get in touch with my colleague Rob if you are interested. Let's see what else is here that we're able to pick up and answer. How do smaller cities and more remote areas kind of investigate, deliver higher disposable income and economic growth over time? It's definitely a challenge for places like Dundee. The physical geography elements to economic growth and its appeal to investors and indeed to firms and workers is real. But we also see that there are indeed some advantages that can come with that isolation as well. So, for example, we consider Norwich to be a relatively isolated urban area compared to other parts of the country. One benefit of that seems to be that Norwich's high streets do relatively well, as it's by far the most dominant spending area in that part of the country. And as a result, its vacancy rates are relatively low and its footfall rates are relatively high, given its other characteristics. So I think for places like Dundee, it's recognizing that it has to offer a different appeal to places like Edinburgh and indeed Glasgow, but still working out ultimately the fundamentals that drive better living standards and better productivity performance at the local level are the consistent factors of the strong private base, strong employment, and indeed easing those constraints on growth at the local level. That will require different interventions than in places like Glasgow, But having devolution and having local control over these issues should maximise the ability for places like Dundee to adjust their policy accordingly. Okay. So yeah, I think final question from me. Well, that answer is average disposable income in the UK in 2024 was 36,700. Yes, so our figures indicate that because we are looking at residents of urban areas in particular, and residents of urban areas are broadly poorer than people who live outside them, because many affluent commuters commute in to urban areas and receive higher wages as a result. The figures will look relatively low compared to the national average, but in in a way we should expect them to be lower because we know that there is that mismatch between the workplace wages and the residents' wages of both cities and of non-urban areas. Okay, so I think in terms of questions we're able to answer in this session, I think that's everything from me. As I said, if you've got any further questions or you'd like to discuss the findings in a bit more detail, by all means, reach out to myself or my colleague Rob. We'd be very happy to have a conversation with you about that. So that's all from me. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.